Hello World asterisk, in the misty hours before dawn, when the first light barely touched the thatched roofs of medieval villages, the sound of wooden clogs on cobblestone paths marked the beginning of another day in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Picture, if you will, the year 1347, a time when the vast majority of Europe's population lived not in grand castles or bustling cities, but in small, scattered villages where life moved to the rhythm of seasons and the demands of feudal lords. The medieval peasant existed in a world that modern minds can barely comprehend. A society built upon a rigid hierarchy that determined not only where you lived and what you ate, but whether you would live or die when crisis struck. At the bottom of this social pyramid sat the villain serfs and free peasants who made up roughly 90% of the European population. These were not the romantic figures of fairy tales, but hardened survivors who had developed intricate systems of mutual aid, agricultural innovation, and social cooperation that would see them through some of history's darkest hours. The feudal system that governed their lives was both their prison and their protection. Under this arrangement, peasants were bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission, yet also entitled to certain protections and rights that would prove crucial during times of crisis. They owed their lord labor, service, typically 3 days a week working the lord's domain land, plus various taxes, rents, and obligations. In return, the lord provided military protection, legal arbitration, and theoretically, support during times of famine or disaster. But the reality was far more complex than this simple exchange might suggest. Medieval peasants developed sophisticated strategies for survival that went far beyond their relationship with their feudal superiors. They created informal networks of mutual assistance, developed agricultural techniques suited to their local environment, and maintained oral traditions that preserved crucial knowledge about weather patterns, crop rotation, and natural remedies. The typical peasant household occupied a single-room dwelling constructed of local materials, timber and daub in forested areas, stone in mountainous regions, or even sod in treeless landscapes. These homes, while modest, were designed for survival. The central hearth provided warmth, light, and a place for cooking, while carefully planned storage areas housed the grain, preserved foods, and tools that meant the difference between life and death during harsh winters or times of scarcity. Family structure among peasants was both nuclear and extended, with multiple generations often sharing the same living space. This arrangement served practical purposes. Older family members provided childcare and preserved traditional knowledge, while able-bodied adults focused on the physically demanding work of agriculture. Children began contributing to household survival from an early age, learning essential skills through observation and participation rather than formal education. The agricultural calendar governed every aspect of peasant life. Spring brought plowing and planting, requiring coordination between households for tasks too large for individual families. Summer meant constant vigilance against pests, weeds, and weather, with communities often working together to protect their collective harvests. Autumn brought the crucial harvest period, when the entire year's survival hung in the balance, followed by threshing, winnowing, and the careful storage of grain that would sustain them through winter. Winter was the season of survival, when stored foods were carefully rationed, animals slaughtered and preserved, and communities drew closer together for warmth and mutual support. It was during these long, dark months that oral traditions flourished. Stories, songs, and accumulated wisdom passed from generation to generation, preserving not just entertainment but crucial survival knowledge. Religious life provided both comfort and practical organization for medieval peasants. The church calendar marked not only spiritual observances, but also important agricultural and social milestones. Saints' days often coincided with seasonal activities, market days, and community gatherings that strengthened the social bonds essential for collective survival. The parish church served as a center for community organization, a repository for important documents, and sometimes as a literal refuge during times of danger. Trade and commerce, while limited, played a crucial role in peasant survival strategies. Local markets allowed communities to exchange surplus goods for items they couldn't produce themselves: iron tools, salt for preservation, or specialized crafts. These markets also served as information exchanges, where news of weather patterns, political developments, or approaching dangers could spread between communities. The legal system, while heavily weighted in favor of the nobility, provided peasants with certain protections that they learned to navigate skillfully. Manorial courts addressed disputes between peasants, enforced community standards, and sometimes provided recourse against overly exploitative lords. Peasants developed a sophisticated understanding of customary law and their rights within it. Feudal system, knowledge that would prove essential when dealing with crisis situations. The survival of medieval peasants depended not on individual heroism or exceptional resources, but on the intricate web of relationships and mutual obligations that bound communities together. These social networks, forged over generations and tested by countless crises, represented one of humanity's most remarkable examples of collective resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. At the heart of peasant survival lay the concept of the village community, a social organism that functioned with remarkable efficiency, despite lacking formal institutions or written constitutions. Villages typically contained between 20 and 100 households, a size that allowed for meaningful personal relationships while providing enough diversity of skills and resources to weather most crises. The layout of these settlements was far from random. Houses were positioned to maximize mutual support, with common areas for shared activities and carefully planned escape routes for times of danger. The practice of open field agriculture created natural opportunities for cooperation and mutual aid. Under this system, individual peasant holdings were scattered across 3 large fields that surrounded the village, with each field following a 3-year rotation cycle of wheat or rye, barley or oats, and fallow. This arrangement required constant coordination between households, as plowing, planting, and harvesting had to be synchronized across the entire community. When one family faced illness or death that threatened their ability to work their strips, neighboring families would step in to ensure that no land went UNCULTIV beyond agriculture. Peasant communities developed sophisticated systems for sharing resources and spreading risk. The village mill, forge, and bakehouse were often jointly owned or operated under arrangements that ensured access for all community members. During grain shortages, communities would implement rationing systems that prioritized pregnant women, nursing mothers, and children, while adults reduced their consumption to ensure the survival of the next generation. These decisions were made through informal consensus building, processes that drew on generations of accumulated wisdom about survival priorities. Marriage patterns among peasants reflected survival strategies as much as personal preference. Marriages typically connected families with complementary skills or resources. A household strong in agricultural labor might ally with one skilled in crafts or trade. Wedding celebrations, while modest, served important community functions, strengthening bonds between families and creating obligations for mutual support that would last for generations. The custom of bride price or dowry ensured that both families invested in the success of the union, creating incentives for ongoing support. God-parentage relationships extended these networks of mutual obligation beyond blood relations. When children were baptized, their godparents assumed responsibilities that went far beyond spiritual guidance. Godparents were expected to provide for their godchildren if the parents died, to offer apprenticeships or marriage connections, and to serve as advocates in disputes. These relationships created interlocking networks of obligation that ensured no child would be left completely without support, even in the most devastating circumstances. The practice of collective labor extended beyond agriculture to include construction, defense, and emergency response. When a family's house burned down, a common occurrence given the prevalence of open fires and thatched roofs, the entire community would mobilize to provide materials, labor, and temporary shelter. Barn raising, road maintenance, and the construction of defensive works were undertaken as community projects, with labor contributions carefully tracked to ensure fairness over time. Village assemblies, while informal, provided mechanisms for collective decision-making that were essential for survival. These gatherings, often held in conjunction with religious observances or market days, addressed issues ranging from crop rotation schedules to the allocation of common resources like woodland and pasture. Decisions were reached through discussion and consensus rather than formal voting, with particular weight given to the opinions of older residents whose experience had been tested by previous crises. The role of women in these survival networks was both crucial and often overlooked by contemporary chroniclers. Women managed household resources, maintained gardens that provided essential vitamins and medicines, and often possessed specialized knowledge of food preservation, brewing, and textile production. During times of crisis, women's networks for sharing information, resources, and childcare responsibilities often proved more resilient than formal male-dominated institutions. Seasonal celebrations and religious festivals served important functions beyond their spiritual significance. Harvest festivals allowed communities to assess their collective food stores and plan for winter rationing. Saints' days provided opportunities for neighboring villages to strengthen ties through shared feasts and celebrations. These gatherings also served as marriage markets, opportunities for trade, and forums for sharing news and information that might affect survival strategies. The management of common resources required sophisticated systems of regulation and enforcement. Village commons, areas of land used jointly for grazing, fuel gathering, and food collection, were governed by detailed customary laws that specified usage rights, seasonal restrictions, and penalties for overexploitation. These systems developed through trial and error over centuries, represented early examples of sustainable resource management that ensured long-term community survival. Conflict resolution mechanisms within peasant communities were designed to preserve social cohesion. rather than establish abstract justice. Disputes over property, obligations, or behavior were typically addressed through mediation by respected community members, with solutions that emphasize restoration and reconciliation over punishment. The goal was always to maintain the social bonds essential for collective survival, even when individual relationships had been damaged. Information networks among peasant communities were remarkably efficient despite the absence of formal communication systems. News of approaching armies, disease outbreaks, or weather patterns spread through networks of kinship, trade, and religious connections that could span hundreds of miles. Traveling merchants, pilgrims, and clergy served as informal news carriers, while seasonal laborers and marriage connections created regular communication links between distant communities. The medieval peasant's relationship with food was one of constant calculation, innovation, and adaptation. Unlike their modern counterparts, who might take their next meal for granted, medieval farmers understood that the difference between abundance and starvation could be determined by decisions made months or even years in advance. Their survival depended not only on producing enough food to sustain their families, but on developing strategies to preserve, store, and ration their harvests through the inevitable periods of scarcity that punctuated medieval life. The three-field system that dominated medieval agriculture was far more sophisticated than modern observers often realize. This rotation pattern, winter grain, spring grain, fallow, represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about soil management, risk distribution, and labor allocation. The winter field, planted with wheat or rye in autumn, provided the staple, grains that formed the backbone of the medieval diet. These hardy cereals could survive harsh winters and provided the dense carbohydrates essential for sustaining heavy agricultural labor. The spring field, planted with barley, oats, or legumes, served multiple purposes in the peasant survival strategy. Barley could be processed into ale, the primary beverage for most medieval peasants, while oats provided food for both humans and the draft animals essential for agricultural work. Legumes like peas and beans not only added protein to the peasant diet but also fixed nitrogen in the soil, improving fertility for future crops. The inclusion of legumes in medieval crop rotations represents an early understanding of soil chemistry that wouldn't be formally recognized by agricultural science for centuries. The fallow year allowed land to recover while providing grazing for livestock, whose manure would restore soil fertility. But this apparently empty year was actually filled with activity. Peasants would use fallow fields for gathering wild foods, pasturing animals, and sometimes planting quick-growing crops like turnips that could be harvested before the field returned to grain production. The flexibility of the fallow year provided peasant communities with options for responding to changing conditions or unexpected opportunities. Beyond the three great fields, peasant families maintained complex gardens and small plots that provided crucial nutritional diversity. These kitchen gardens, typically managed by women, produced herbs for cooking and medicine, vegetables that provided essential vitamins, and fruit trees that offered seasonal treats and preservable surplus. The knowledge required to maintain these gardens, understanding of companion planting, seasonal timing, and natural pest control, represented a sophisticated form of agricultural science, passed down through generations of careful observation and experimentation. Food preservation was perhaps the most critical skill in the peasant survival toolkit. Without refrigeration or canning technology, medieval families had to rely on techniques that had been refined over millennia. Grains were stored in carefully constructed granaries designed to protect against moisture, pests, and theft. These storage facilities, often built on stilts to prevent rat access and equipped with tight-fitting lids to exclude insects, could mean the difference between survival and starvation during a harsh winter or failed harvest. Meat preservation required even more sophisticated techniques. The autumn slaughter, when animals that couldn't be fed through winter were killed, was followed by intensive work to preserve as much protein as possible. Smoking, salting, and drying transformed fresh meat into products that could last for months. The production of sausages, bacon, and preserved meats was both an art and a science, requiring precise knowledge of salt concentrations, smoking temperatures, and storage conditions. Dairy products provided another avenue for food preservation and nutritional security. Milk could be transformed into cheese and butter that would keep far longer than the original product, while also concentrating nutrients and calories. Different types of cheese, from soft, fresh varieties consumed immediately to hard-aged cheeses that could last through winter, gave peasant families options for managing their dairy resources according to seasonal availability and storage capacity. The brewing of ale served multiple functions in peasant survival strategies. Beyond providing a safe alternative to potentially contaminated water, ale was a source of calories and B vitamins that could supplement the grain-heavy peasant diet. The brewing process itself helped preserve grain stores by transforming them into a product less susceptible to spoilage, while the communal nature of brewing created opportunities for sharing resources and labor among neighboring families. Wild foods played a crucial role in peasant nutrition, particularly during the hunger gap of late spring and early summer when stored grains were running low and new crops hadn't yet ripened. Peasant communities maintained detailed knowledge of edible plants, mushrooms, nuts, and berries that could supplement cultivated foods. This knowledge was particularly important during years of poor harvests, when wild foods might mean the difference between survival and starvation. The timing of agricultural activities required sophisticated understanding of weather patterns, soil conditions, and seasonal changes. Peasant farmers developed detailed mental calendars based on natural phenomena, the blooming of certain plants, the behavior of animals, the position of stars, that guided their planting and harvesting decisions. This traditional ecological knowledge, accumulated over generations, often proved more reliable than formal calendars for predicting optimal timing for agricultural activities. Risk management was built into every aspect of peasant agricultural strategy. Fields were scattered across different locations to reduce the impact of localized disasters like floods or hail. Multiple crop varieties were planted to hedge against specific diseases or weather conditions. Seed stocks were carefully maintained and protected, with some grain always held back from consumption to ensure the following year's planting. These practices, while they might reduce short-term yields, provided insurance against the catastrophic failures that could destroy less cautious farmers. The integration of livestock into peasant agricultural systems provided multiple benefits. For food security, pigs could be fed on agricultural waste and forest mast, converting inedible materials into high-quality protein. Chickens provided both eggs and meat while consuming pests that might otherwise damage crops. Cattle and oxen not only provided meat and dairy products, but also the draft power essential for plowing and transportation. The management of these animals required sophisticated understanding of nutrition, breeding, and disease prevention. Labor allocation within peasant households reflected the critical importance of food production and processing. Tasks were distributed according to age, gender, and physical capability, with everyone from small children to elderly grandparents contributing to the family's food security. This division of labor ensured that essential tasks were completed even when individual family members were unavailable due to illness, injury, or other obligations. The relationship between individual households and community food security was complex and interdependent. While families were primarily responsible for feeding themselves, community institutions like grain stores, communal ovens, and shared processing facilities provided backup systems for times of individual or collective crisis. The balance between individual responsibility and community support required constant negotiation and adjustment based on changing circumstances. The specter of famine haunted every medieval peasant's dreams, a constant reminder that even in good years, disaster was never more than one failed harvest away. The great famines that swept across Europe between 1315 and 1322 would demonstrate just how precarious peasant existence truly was. But they also revealed the remarkable resilience and adaptability that allowed communities to survive even when the very foundations of their agricultural world seemed to crumble beneath them. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 began with unusual weather, patterns that disrupted the carefully calibrated agricultural systems peasants had developed over centuries. Excessive rainfall in the spring of 1315 prevented proper planting across much of northern Europe, while continued wet weather throughout the growing season led to widespread crop failures. Rivers flooded, washing away precious topsoil and drowning standing crops. The persistent moisture created ideal conditions for plant diseases that devastated what little grain managed to survive the initial weather. Disasters. But peasant communities didn't simply passively accept starvation. Instead, they activated survival strategies that had been refined through previous crises and passed down through generations of hard-won experience. The first response was typically to implement community-wide rationing systems that prioritized the survival of the group over individual comfort. Grain stores that had been carefully maintained for exactly such emergencies were opened and their contents distributed according to formulas that balanced immediate need against long-term survival prospects. When stored grains ran low, peasant communities turned to alternative food sources that required detailed knowledge of local ecosystems and traditional preparation methods. Tree bark, particularly from oak, birch, and pine, could be ground into flour that, while nutritionally poor, provided enough carbohydrates to sustain life when mixed with whatever grain remained available. The process of preparing bark flour was complex and potentially dangerous. Improper preparation could result in foods that were indigestible or even toxic. But medieval peasants possessed detailed knowledge of harvesting techniques, processing methods, and recipes that made these survival foods both edible and somewhat nutritious. Wild plants became crucial components of famine diets, but harvesting them safely required sophisticated botanical knowledge. Peasant communities maintained oral traditions that identified edible plants, their optimal harvesting times, and proper preparation methods. Nettles, dandelions, plantain, and dozens of. Other plants could provide essential vitamins and minerals during periods when traditional crops were unavailable. But the line between food and poison was often thin. The same plant that could save lives when properly prepared could cause illness or death if harvested at the wrong time or processed incorrectly. The social dynamics of famine survival revealed both the strength and fragility of medieval community bonds. While rationing systems and mutual aid networks helped many communities weather the worst periods of scarcity, the stress of prolonged hunger also created tensions that could tear apart the social fabric that normally held peasant societies together. Accusations of hoarding, theft of food stores, and conflicts over the distribution of scarce resources could destroy relationships that had taken generations to build. Migration became a survival strategy when local resources were completely exhausted. But medieval peasants faced enormous obstacles when attempting to move to areas with better food supplies. The feudal system that normally provided protection and structure became a barrier to movement, as serfs were legally bound to their lord's land and could face severe punishment for attempting to leave without permission. Even free peasants found that neighboring communities, struggling with their own food shortages, were unlikely to welcome refugees who would compete for already scarce resources. The role of religious institutions during famines was complex and sometimes contradictory. Monasteries and church organizations possessed some of the largest grain stores in medieval Europe, accumulated through tithes, donations, and their own agricultural operations. During severe famines, these institutions sometimes provided crucial assistance to starving communities, distributing grain and operating soup kitchens that kept thousands alive. However, church resources were also limited, and religious authorities had to balance their charitable obligations against their own institutional survival needs. Trade relationships that normally provided opportunities for exchanging surplus goods became lifelines during famine periods. Communities with access to rivers, roads, or trade routes could sometimes obtain grain from distant regions that hadn't been affected by the same weather disasters. But famine conditions drove up food prices dramatically, making grain unaffordable for most peasant families. The merchants who could provide life-saving supplies often demanded payment in land, livestock, or future labor obligations that could impoverish communities for generations. The physical and psychological impacts of prolonged malnutrition created additional challenges for famine survival. Weakened by hunger, people became more susceptible to diseases that might not have been fatal under normal circumstances. Cognitive function declined, making it harder to make the complex decisions required for survival. Social relationships deteriorated as stress and desperation overcame normal behavioral constraints. Communities had to find ways to maintain cooperation and mutual support, even as individuals became increasingly desperate and unpredictable. Women's roles became particularly crucial during famine periods, as their traditional responsibilities for food preparation and resource management translated into specialized knowledge essential for survival. Women often possessed detailed understanding of food preservation techniques, knowledge of wild edible plants, and experience in stretching limited ingredients to feed entire families. Their networks of relationships with other women could provide access to resources and information that might not be available through male-dominated institutions. Children face particular vulnerabilities during famines. as their growing bodies required proportionally more nutrition than adults, while their smaller size gave them fewer reserves to draw upon during periods of scarcity. Communities developed strategies for protecting children that sometimes involved difficult decisions about resource allocation. Young children might be given priority access to available food, while older children could be sent to live with relatives in less affected areas or apprenticed to masters, who could provide sustenance in exchange for labor. The long-term effects: a famine extended far beyond the immediate period of food shortage. Malnutrition during childhood could result in stunted growth and reduced physical capacity that lasted throughout an individual's life. Communities that survived famines often faced years of recovery as they rebuilt depleted livestock herds, restored soil fertility that had been damaged by desperate attempts to increase yields, and re-established the social relationships that had been strained by the crisis. The psychological trauma of famine also left lasting marks on communities and individuals. Survivors developed heightened awareness of food security that influenced their behavior for years after the crisis ended. Hoarding behaviors, extreme caution in resource allocation, and reluctance to trust in the stability of food supplies became common responses that could persist for generations. These psychological adaptations, while sometimes dysfunctional in normal times, represented rational responses to experiences that had demonstrated just how quickly security could disappear. Recovery from major famines required coordinated community effort and often assistance from external sources. Rebuilding agricultural capacity meant not only replanting fields, but also restoring the complex social systems that made peasant agriculture possible. Seed grain had to be obtained, often through loans or gifts that created new obligations and dependencies. Draft animals that had been slaughtered for food during the worst periods of hunger had to be replaced. Most importantly, communities had to rebuild the trust and cooperation that made collective survival possible. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, it brought with it a terror that transcended anything medieval peasants had previously experienced. Unlike famines, which could be anticipated through weather patterns and crop failures or wars, which followed recognizable patterns of human conflict, plague struck without warning and killed without discrimination. Yet even in the face of this seemingly unstoppable destroyer, peasant communities demonstrated remarkable adaptability, developing responses that would influence European society for centuries to come. The first cases of plague often appeared in ports and trading centers, carried by the fleas that infested the rats, aboard merchant ships arriving from the east. But the disease spread with terrifying speed along the same trade routes and communication networks that normally brought prosperity and news to rural communities. A merchant who seemed healthy when he arrived at a village market might be dead within days, leaving behind not only his goods, but also the invisible seeds of destruction that would soon claim dozens of local lives. Medieval peasants had no understanding of bacteria or the disease vectors that actually spread plague, but they quickly observed patterns that helped them develop effective survival strategies. They noticed that plague seemed to follow trade routes and affect crowded areas more severely than isolated communities. They observed that the disease often struck entire households simultaneously, suggesting some form of contagion that could spread between people living in close proximity. Most importantly, they recognized that survival often depended on rapid response to the first signs of disease in their community. the initial peasant response to plague outbreaks was often flight, but this strategy required careful planning and resources that not all families possessed. Those who chose to flee had to abandon their homes, crops, and most possessions, carrying only what they could transport on foot or in small carts. They faced the challenge of finding communities willing to accept refugees who might themselves be carrying the disease, and of surviving in unfamiliar territory without the support networks that normally sustain peasant families. For communities that chose to remain in place, isolation became the primary survival strategy. Villages would post guards on roads leading to their settlements, turning away travelers and merchants who might bring disease. Market days were canceled, religious gatherings suspended, and even family visits between neighboring communities prohibited. This isolation came at enormous economic and social cost, cutting communities off from trade, news, and the mutual support networks that normally helped them weather crises. Within affected communities, peasant families developed household-level quarantine practices that often proved remarkably effective. When someone showed signs of illness, they might be isolated in separate buildings or rooms, with designated family members serving as caregivers who had minimal contact with the rest of the household. Food and water were left outside sick rooms, and contaminated materials were burned or buried far from living areas. These practices, while lacking scientific understanding of disease transmission, often succeeded in limiting the spread of infection within families. The disruption of normal agricultural activities during plague outbreaks created secondary crises that could be as devastating as the disease itself. Fields went unplanted or unharvested as communities lost the labor necessary for agricultural work. Livestock died from neglect or were slaughtered unnecessarily when there was no one available to care for them. The careful balance of labor, resources, and timing that made peasant agriculture possible could collapse completely when plague struck during critical periods of the agricultural calendar. Women's roles became particularly crucial during plague outbreaks, as they often served as primary caregivers for sick family members while also maintaining household functions when men were incapacitated or dead. Their traditional knowledge of herbal remedies and healing practices took on new importance, even though most traditional treatments proved ineffective against plague. Women also often took on agricultural and economic responsibilities normally handled by men, learning skills and assuming authority roles that could permanently alter gender relationships within communities. The religious dimension of plague created both opportunities and challenges for peasant survival strategies. Many saw the disease as divine punishment for sin, leading to intensive prayers, processions, and religious observances intended to appease God's wrath. These activities, while providing psychological comfort, often had the unintended effect of bringing people together in ways that facilitated disease transmission. Churches and religious gatherings became focal points for infection, forcing communities to balance spiritual needs against practical survival requirements. Some peasant communities developed innovative economic arrangements to cope with the labor shortages and social disruption caused by plague deaths. Land that had been carefully divided among multiple families might be consolidated under survivors who could actually work it. Marriage patterns shifted as young people sought partners from outside their devastated communities, creating new kinship networks to replace those destroyed by disease. Apprenticeship and labor agreements were renegotiated to reflect the changed balance between available workers and economic opportunities. The psychological impact of plague was as significant as its physical effects, creating trauma that influenced peasant behavior long after the immediate crisis had passed. Survivors often displayed increased religious devotion, fatalistic attitudes toward death, or conversely, a heightened appreciation for life's pleasures that manifested in more elaborate celebrations and social gatherings. The experience of seeing entire families wiped out in days created a heightened awareness of mortality that influenced everything from marriage decisions to economic planning. Children who survived plague outbreaks often faced unique challenges, as the disease frequently killed their parents and other adult caregivers. Peasant communities developed informal adoption networks that ensured orphan children were absorbed into surviving households. But these arrangements often came with obligations and dependencies that could last for generations. Young plague survivors might find themselves inheriting property and responsibilities far beyond their years, forcing rapid maturation and adaptation to adult roles. The long-term demographic effects of plague created opportunities as well as challenges for surviving peasant communities. The massive population losses left more land available per surviving family, potentially improving living standards for those who lived through the crisis. However, the reduced labor force also made it difficult to maintain the complex agricultural systems that had sustained larger populations, forcing communities to adapt their farming practices to their reduced numbers. Recovery from plague outbreaks required not only the restoration of population and economic activity, but also the rebuilding of social institutions and cultural practices that have been disrupted by the crisis. Communities had to develop new leadership structures to replace traditional authorities who had died, create new systems for organizing agricultural work with reduced labor forces, and establish new social relationships to replace kinship networks that had been destroyed by disease. The experience of surviving plague fundamentally changed peasant attitudes toward authority, tradition, and social organization. Communities that had successfully managed their own survival during the crisis often showed reduced deference to feudal lords and religious authorities, who had been unable to protect them from disease. This shift in attitudes would contribute to broader social changes that characterized the late medieval period, including increased social mobility, challenges to traditional authority structures, and new forms of economic organization. Medical knowledge, while still primitive by modern standards, did advance as a result of plague experiences. Peasant communities accumulated practical understanding of quarantine procedures, herbal treatments that could ease symptoms if not cure disease, and environmental factors that seemed to influence disease transmission. This knowledge, passed down through oral traditions and practical experience, formed the foundation for more sophisticated public health measures that would develop in later centuries. The medieval countryside was never truly at peace, and peasant communities lived under the constant threat of violence from multiple sources. Professional armies fighting their lords' wars, bands of brigands seeking easy plunder, and neighboring communities competing for scarce resources all posed existential threats to villages that had little means of defense beyond their own ingenuity and cooperation. The strategies peasants developed to survive these violent encounters reveal sophisticated understanding of military tactics, psychological warfare, and community organization that allowed agricultural communities to persist despite centuries of nearly constant conflict. The approach of hostile forces was often preceded by signs that experienced peasants learned to read with deadly accuracy. Smoke on the horizon might indicate burning villages in the army's path, while unusual movements of birds or animals could signal the presence of large groups of men moving through the countryside. Refugees fleeing from previously attacked settlements brought news of approaching danger, but they also represented mouths to feed and potentially dangerous security risks if they included enemy scouts or informants. When warning of approaching violence reached a peasant community, the response had to be both swift and carefully coordinated. The decision between flight and defense was crucial and often meant the difference between community survival and total destruction. Flight offered the possibility of preserving lives, but meant abandoning homes, crops, livestock, and the accumulated wealth of generations. Defense might save property, but could result in the massacre of the entire community if the attackers proved too powerful to resist. Those communities that chose flight had developed elaborate evacuation procedures refined through previous experiences. With warfare and brigandage, priority was given to saving seed grain, breeding livestock, and portable valuables that could help restart community life in a new location. Elderly and disabled community members who couldn't travel might choose to remain behind, either to die in familiar surroundings or to serve as decoys who could mislead attackers about the location of fleeing families. The logistics of moving entire communities required careful planning and detailed knowledge of local geography. Escape routes had to avoid main roads where refugees might encounter hostile forces, while also providing access to water, shelter, and possibly sympathetic communities willing to offer temporary sanctuary. Women, children, and livestock moved more slowly than adult men, requiring advanced planning and sometimes the division of families as younger men stayed behind to fight rearguard actions while families fled to safety. Communities that chose to defend themselves faced the challenge of transforming agricultural settlements into military fortifications with limited time and resources. Village churches, with their stone construction and elevated positions, often served as final refuges where defenders could make their last stand. Wells were poisoned or filled with debris to deny water to attackers, while grain stores and other valuable supplies were hidden or destroyed to prevent their capture. The construction of temporary fortifications required both engineering knowledge and coordinated labor that could transform a peaceful village into a defensive stronghold within hours. Peasants learned to create barriers from overturned carts, felled trees, and hastily dug ditches that could channel attacking forces into prepared killing zones where defenders' limited weapons could be most effective. These fortifications might not stop a determined assault, but they could make conquest costly enough to encourage attackers to seek easier targets elsewhere. Weapons available to peasant defenders were typically agricultural tools adapted for combat, but peasant communities also maintained hidden stores of more sophisticated armaments acquired through trade, salvage from previous battles, or secret manufacture by village smiths. Scythes could be straightened and mounted on longer poles to create effective polearms, while flails used for threshing grain became devastating weapons in the hands of peasants familiar with their use. Crossbows, easier to master than longbows, provided peasant defenders with ranged weapons that could penetrate the armor of professional soldiers. The psychology of peasant warfare differed significantly from professional military encounters. Peasants fought not for glory, pay, or political objectives, but for the survival of their families and communities. This desperate motivation often made them more dangerous opponents than professional soldiers expected, leading to fierce resistance that could bloody even experienced military forces. Peasant defenders also possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain that allowed them to set ambushes, create diversions, and exploit natural advantages that visiting armies couldn't anticipate. Night attacks became a preferred peasant tactic. When facing superior forces, as darkness negated many of the advantages held by better-equipped professional soldiers, peasants familiar with every path, building, and hiding place in their territory could move silently through their own villages, while attackers stumbled blindly through unfamiliar terrain. Fire became a weapon of choice during these nighttime encounters. Burning buildings could create chaos and confusion while also denying shelter to occupying forces. The treatment of prisoners and the aftermath of combat posed particular challenges for peasant communities. Professional armies operated under codes of conduct that provided some protection for captured enemies, but peasants often faced massacre if defeated and had little incentive to show mercy to attackers who threatened their family's survival. The decision to kill, ransom, or release captured enemies required careful consideration of both immediate security needs and long-term consequences for community safety. Women and children played crucial roles in peasant defense strategies, often serving as intelligence gatherers, supply carriers, and even combatants when circumstances required. Children could move through battlefields more easily than adults, carrying messages between defenders or gathering arrows and other weapons for reuse. Women maintained supply lines that kept defenders fed and equipped during extended sieges, while also providing medical care for wounded fighters. The economic impacts of warfare extended far beyond immediate battle damage, creating challenges that could threaten community survival long after fighting ended. Crops destroyed or unharvested during conflicts meant potential famine in the following year, while livestock killed or stolen reduced communities' ability to plow fields or provide protein. The disruption of trade relationships could cut off access to iron tools, salt, and other essential supplies that communities couldn't produce themselves. Recovery from warfare required not only rebuilding physical infrastructure, but also restoring the social relationships and economic systems that made peasant communities viable. Houses could be rebuilt relatively quickly using local materials and community labor, but replacing livestock, tools, and seed grain often required assistance from neighboring communities or lords. The psychological trauma of violence also had to be addressed as communities struggled to return to normal agricultural rhythms after experiencing the terror and disruption of combat. Some peasant communities developed relationships with professional military forces that provided protection in exchange for supplies, intelligence, or temporary shelter. These arrangements could offer security against brigands and enemy armies, but they also created dependencies that could prove costly if military fortunes changed. Communities that harbored one-side soldiers might face retaliation from their enemies, while the presence of armed men could create internal tensions and security risks. The rise of brigandage as communities broke down during periods of warfare created particular challenges for peasant survival. Unlike professional armies that might follow some rules of conduct, brigand bands operated purely for profit and showed little restraint in their treatment of rural communities. These groups often included former peasants who had been displaced by warfare and turned to banditry as their only means of survival, creating complex moral and practical challenges for communities trying to defend themselves. Fortified manor houses and castles sometimes provided refuge for peasant communities during times of danger, but access to these sanctuaries often came with significant costs. Lords might demand additional labor service, increased rents, or military obligations in exchange for protection, creating new forms of dependency that could persist long after immediate dangers had passed. The relationship between protection and exploitation was complex and constantly negotiated based on the relative power and desperation of both parties. The development of early warning networks between communities created regional defense systems that could provide advanced notice of approaching threats. Signal fires, messenger systems, and shared intelligence allowed isolated villages to coordinate their responses to common dangers, sometimes enabling successful resistance against forces that might have overwhelmed individual communities. These networks also facilitated mutual aid during recovery periods, as communities that had escaped damage could assist neighbors that had suffered losses. The relationship between medieval peasants and their feudal lords represented one of history's most complex systems of mutual obligation, protection, and exploitation. While modern perspectives often view feudalism as simple oppression of the poor by the powerful, the reality was far more nuanced, involving intricate negotiations, customary rights, and survival strategies that allowed peasant communities to maintain some degree of autonomy, even within highly hierarchical social structures. Understanding how peasants navigated these relationships reveals sophisticated political skills that were essential for community survival. The feudal contract, while never written in formal legal documents, was governed by centuries of tradition and customary law that both lords and peasants understood with remarkable precision. Peasants owed their lords specific obligations, typically 3 days of labor per week on the lord's domain land, plus additional service during harvest time and other peak periods. They also paid various rents and fees. Tallage for the right to remain on the land, merchant for permission to marry, and harriet, typically the family's best animal, when the head of household died. But these obligations came with corresponding rights that peasants jealously guarded and skillfully exploited. Lords were expected to provide military protection, legal arbitration, and assistance during times of famine or disaster. The lord's mill, bakehouse, and brewery were supposed to serve peasant needs, even though peasants paid fees for these services. Most importantly, customary law protected peasants from arbitrary increases in their obligations and provided mechanisms for appealing unfair treatment. The manorial court system, while dominated by the lord or his representatives, provided peasants with forums for asserting their rights and resolving disputes. These courts met regularly to address issues ranging from boundary disputes between peasant holdings to conflicts over obligation fulfillment. Peasants learned to present their cases effectively, citing precedent and customary law to support their positions. The presence of other community members as witnesses and judges meant that lords couldn't simply ignore established customs without facing community resistance. Peasant communities developed sophisticated strategies for collective bargaining with their lords, understanding that unified resistance was more effective than individual complaints. When lords attempted to increase obligations or impose new fees, entire villages might coordinate their responses, presenting unified petitions or even engaging in work slowdowns that could cripple manorial agriculture. These collective actions required careful organization and communication, as peasants had to balance assertion of their rights against the risk of harsh retaliation. The timing of resistance was crucial, as peasants learned to leverage seasonal agricultural requirements and political circumstances to maximize their bargaining power. Protests during planting or harvest seasons could threaten the economic foundation of the entire manor, while lords facing military campaigns or political challenges might be more willing to negotiate rather than deal with internal conflicts. Peasants became adept at reading political situations and choosing moments when their actions would have maximum impact. Individual peasants also developed personal relationships with lords and manorial officials that could provide protection and opportunities for advancement. Skilled craftsmen, effective organizers, or peasants with specialized knowledge might gain favor that translated into reduced obligations, better land assignments, or protection from legal challenges. These relationships required careful cultivation and maintenance, as they could provide crucial advantages during times of crisis. The role of reeves, peasants elected by their communities to serve as intermediaries with manorial authority, was particularly important in managing lord-peasant relationships. Reeves had to balance the interests of their communities against the demands of manorial lords, often facing impossible situations where satisfying one party meant disappointing the other. Successful reeves developed diplomatic skills that allowed them to negotiate compromises, deflect unreasonable demands, and protect their communities from excessive exploitation. Women's relationships with feudal authority were complicated by their legal status as dependents of male family members, but they also found ways to assert influence and protect their interests. Widows might inherit significant holdings that gave them direct relationships with manorial lords, while women's traditional roles in food production and textile work made them valuable to manorial economies. Some women gained influence through marriages that connected their families to manorial officials or neighboring lords. The management of common resources, forests, pastures, and wastelands required constant negotiation between peasant communities and manorial authority. Peasants needed access to these resources for fuel, building materials, and animal pasture, while lords sought to maximize revenue from the same lands through controlled exploitation. Customary rights to collect deadwood, graze animals, or gather wild foods were jealously guarded by peasant communities and frequently disputed in manorial courts. Economic relationships, beyond simple agricultural obligations, created additional opportunities for peasant-lord interaction. Peasants might lease additional land during good years when they had surplus labor and resources, while lords might hire peasant craftsmen for construction projects or specialized tasks. These voluntary economic relationships often provided more favorable terms than mandatory feudal obligations, creating incentives for both parties to maintain good working relationships. The church's role in feudal relationships was complex and sometimes contradictory. Religious authorities preached obedience to secular authority while also advocating for the protection of the poor and oppressed. Parish priests, often drawn from peasant communities themselves, might serve as advocates for their parishioners in disputes with secular lords. The church's parallel legal system also provided alternative forms for resolving certain types of disputes, particularly those involving marriage, inheritance, and moral conduct. Legal strategies available to peasants included appeals to higher authorities when manorial lords exceeded their customary powers. Royal courts, while expensive and difficult to access, sometimes provided remedy for the most egregious abuses of feudal authority. More commonly, peasants might appeal to their lord's feudal superiors, citing violations of customary law or failure to fulfill protective obligations. These appeals required sophisticated understanding of legal procedures and political relationships. The documentation of customary rights became increasingly important as populations grew and economic pressures intensified. Peasant communities worked to preserve oral traditions that recorded their historical rights and obligations, while also seeking written confirmations of their privileges when opportunities arose. The creation of customs, written records of local customs and rights, often resulted from negotiations between peasant communities and manorial authorities, seeking to clarify their respective obligations. Economic diversification provided peasants with alternatives to purely agricultural relationships with their lords. Craft production, trade, and services could generate income that reduced dependence on agricultural holdings, while also providing lords with new sources of revenue through licensing fees and taxes. Peasants who developed successful non-agricultural enterprises might gain enough economic independence to negotiate more favorable terms for their feudal obligations. The breakdown of feudal relationships during times of crisis, warfare, plague, or economic disruption created both opportunities and dangers for peasant communities. The absence or death of lords might provide temporary freedom from feudal obligations, but it also removed protection and arbitration services that communities depended upon. Peasants had to develop alternative forms of organization and protection, while also positioning themselves for favorable relationships with new lords who might eventually claim authority over their territories. Migration, while legally restricted for serfs, provided some peasants with opportunities to escape unfavorable feudal relationships. The growth of towns and cities created labor markets where peasants might find employment that offered better terms than agricultural serfdom. However, successful migration required careful planning, resources for travel and establishment in new locations, and often the complicity of receiving communities willing to harbor fugitive serfs. The long-term evolution of feudal relationships was influenced by demographic, economic, and political changes that gradually shifted the balance of power between lords and peasants. Population growth increased demand for land while also providing lords with larger labor forces. Economic development created new sources of wealth and new forms of social organization that competed with traditional feudal structures. Political centralization by royal authorities sometimes provided peasants with protections against local exploitation, while also creating new forms of taxation and obligation. In a world without doctors, hospitals, or pharmaceutical companies, medieval peasants developed sophisticated systems of healthcare that combined practical knowledge, herbal medicine, and community support to address the health challenges that threatened individual and collective survival. These healing traditions, passed down through generations of careful observation and experimentation, represented one of medieval society's most remarkable achievements enabling communities to maintain their health and productivity despite the absence of formal medical institutions. The foundation of peasant healthcare was an intimate understanding of the human body, developed through necessity rather than formal education. Women, as the primary caregivers in most households, accumulated detailed knowledge of symptoms, treatments, and recovery processes through years of tending to sick family members. This experiential learning was supplemented by oral traditions that preserved the collective medical wisdom of entire communities, creating informal but highly effective systems of healthcare delivery. Herbal medicine formed the cornerstone of peasant therapeutic practice, requiring sophisticated botanical knowledge that encompassed not only the identification of medicinal plants, but also their proper harvesting, preparation, and application. Village healers, typically older women with decades of experience, maintained detailed mental catalogs of hundreds of plants and their therapeutic properties. They knew that willow bark could reduce fever and pain, that foxglove could regulate heart rhythm, and that various mushrooms could serve as both medicine and poison. Depending on dosage and preparation, the timing of herb collection was crucial to their effectiveness, requiring deep understanding of seasonal cycles and optimal harvesting conditions. Peasant healers knew that some plants were most potent when collected at dawn, others at sunset, and still others during specific phases of the moon. Root medicines were typically gathered in autumn when the plant's energy was concentrated underground, while flower and leaf preparations required collection during peak blooming periods when active compounds were most concentrated. Preparation methods for herbal medicines were as important as the selection of appropriate plants, involving techniques that modern pharmacology recognizes as sophisticated extraction processes. Tinctures created by soaking herbs in alcohol could preserve active compounds for months or years, while decoctions that involved boiling plant materials could concentrate therapeutic substances into potent liquid medicines. Poultices and salves allowed external application of healing compounds, while smoked herbs could deliver medicines directly to respiratory ailments. The diagnostic skills of peasant healers were remarkably sophisticated, despite their lack of formal medical training. They learned to read subtle signs of illness, changes in skin color, breath odor, pulse patterns, and behavioral indicators that could reveal developing health problems before they became life-threatening. This early detection capability was crucial in communities where advanced medical intervention was impossible, making prevention and early treatment the primary strategies for maintaining health. Childbirth represented one of the most critical healthcare challenges facing peasant communities, as maternal and infant mortality rates were extremely high by modern standards. Midwives, typically experienced women who had successfully raised multiple children of their own, developed specialized knowledge of pregnancy, labor, and postnatal care that could mean the difference between life and death for both mothers and babies. These women understood positioning techniques that could facilitate difficult births, herbal preparations that could strengthen contractions or reduce bleeding, and emergency procedures that could save lives when complications arose. The training of new healers involved lengthy apprenticeships that combined practical experience with theoretical knowledge passed down through oral tradition. Young women showing aptitude for healing work would be taken under the wing of experienced practitioners, learning through observation, participation, and gradually increasing responsibility. This education might take years to complete, as aspiring healers had to master not only the technical aspects of medicine, but also the interpersonal skills necessary for providing care in crisis situations. Mental health challenges, while not understood in modern psychological terms, were recognized and addressed through community-based interventions that combined practical support with spiritual and social healing. Depression, anxiety, and other emotional disorders were often attributed to spiritual causes or social disruption, leading to treatments that involved religious rituals, community support systems, and sometimes herbal preparations that modern science recognizes as having genuine psychoactive effects. Surgical procedures, while primitive by contemporary standards, were performed by peasant healers for injuries and conditions that threatened life or function. Bone setting, wound cleaning, and suturing, tooth extraction, and even basic cataract surgery were within the capabilities of skilled practitioners. These procedures required not only technical knowledge, but also the ability to manage pain and infection with available resources, often involving herbal anesthetics and antiseptics derived from local plants. The role of nutrition in health maintenance was well understood by peasant communities, even though they lacked modern understanding of vitamins, minerals, and other nutritional requirements. Healers knew that certain foods could prevent or cure specific ailments, that liver could restore strength after blood loss, that fresh vegetables could prevent the weakness and tooth loss associated with scurvy, and that fermented dairy products could aid digestion and prevent certain intestinal disorders. Infectious disease management required community-wide coordination that combined individual treatment with public health measures designed to prevent epidemic spread. When contagious illnesses appeared, peasant communities would implement isolation procedures, sanitation practices, and sometimes mass treatments that could limit disease transmission. These responses were based on empirical observation of disease patterns rather than theoretical understanding of contagion, but they often proved remarkably effective. The integration of spiritual and physical healing reflected medieval understanding of health as encompassing both bodily and spiritual well-being. Prayers, religious rituals, and appeals to saints were routinely combined with herbal medicines and practical treatments, creating comprehensive healing approaches that address multiple aspects of illness. This holistic perspective often provided psychological comfort that enhanced the effectiveness of physical treatments. Veterinary knowledge was equally important to peasant communities, as the health of livestock directly affected human survival prospects. Animal healers, often the same individuals who treated human ailments, developed specialized knowledge of animal anatomy, disease symptoms, and therapeutic interventions that could preserve valuable draft animals, dairy cows, and breeding stock. The loss of key animals could devastate a peasant household's economic prospects, making veterinary skills crucial for community survival. The economics of healthcare in peasant communities was based primarily on mutual aid and reciprocal obligations, rather than monetary payment. Healers were typically compensated through gifts of food, labor, or future assistance rather than cash transactions. This system ensured that medical care remained accessible to all community members, regardless of their economic status, while also creating social bonds that strengthened community cohesion. Documentation and preservation of medical knowledge presented ongoing challenges for communities that relied primarily on oral traditions. Some healers maintained written records of recipes, treatments, and case histories, but most knowledge was preserved through memorization and repeated practice. The death of an experienced healer could represent a significant loss of community. Medical knowledge, making the training of successors a crucial priority for ensuring long-term healthcare capabilities. The relationship between peasant healers and formal medical authorities was complex and sometimes antagonistic. Church authorities were often suspicious of healing practices that appeared to involve magic or pagan traditions, while university-trained physicians sometimes dismissed peasant medicine as ignorant superstition. However, there was also significant cross-pollination of knowledge, as formal medical practitioners often incorporated peasant remedies into their own practices, while peasant healers gained access to written medical texts and formal anatomical knowledge. Quality control and safety in peasant medicine depended on the experience and reputation of individual healers rather than formal regulatory systems. Communities developed informal mechanisms for evaluating healing practices and practitioners, with successful treatments enhancing a healer's reputation, while failures could damage credibility and reduce future practice opportunities. This system, while imperfect, provided some protection against dangerous or ineffective treatments. The evolution of peasant medical practices was driven by continuous experimentation and adaptation as communities encountered new health challenges and discovered new therapeutic resources. Healers were constantly testing new plant combinations, refining preparation techniques, and adapting treatments based on observed results. This empirical approach to medical development, while lacking modern scientific rigor, produced genuine advances in therapeutic knowledge that sometimes preceded formal medical discoveries by centuries. Asterisk. The children of medieval peasant families entered the world with few guarantees beyond the promise of hardship, yet they also inherited traditions of resilience, community support, and practical wisdom that had sustained their ancestors through centuries of survival challenges. The process of raising children in medieval villages was simultaneously more precarious and more communal than modern parenting, involving entire communities in the education, protection, and socialization of the next generation who would carry forward the accumulated knowledge essential for collective survival. Infancy represented the most dangerous period of medieval childhood, with mortality rates that could reach 50% or higher during particularly harsh years. Peasant mothers, lacking access to modern medical care or nutrition, had to rely on traditional practices and community knowledge to give their babies the best possible chance of survival. Breastfeeding continued for extended periods, often 2 years or more, both to provide optimal nutrition and to delay subsequent pregnancies that might overwhelm family resources. The naming of children reflected both spiritual beliefs and practical considerations that would influence their entire lives. Saints' names provided religious protection and connected children to specific patron saints who might intercede on their behalf during times of crisis. But names also carried social significance, identifying family lineages, occupational expectations, and sometimes regional origins that could affect marriage prospects and social relationships throughout the child's life. Early childhood education began almost immediately after birth, as infants were constantly exposed to the sights, sounds, and rhythms of peasant life that would shape their understanding of the world. Lullabies and nursery rhymes served multiple purposes, providing comfort and entertainment while also transmitting cultural values. Seasonal knowledge, and sometimes coded information about survival strategies that couldn't be openly discussed. In the presence of feudal authorities, the transition from infancy to childhood was marked not by formal ceremonies, but by the gradual assumption of responsibilities that would prepare children for adult survival challenges. By age 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute meaningfully to household tasks, beginning with simple activities like gathering eggs, feeding chickens, or helping with food preparation. These early responsibilities taught essential skills while also demonstrating each child's value to family survival. Gender roles were established early and reflected the practical necessities of peasant life rather than abstract ideological principles. Boys were typically directed toward agricultural work, learning to use tools, care for livestock, and understand the seasonal rhythms that governed crop production. Girls focused on household management, food preservation, textile production, and the healthcare knowledge that would make them essential partners in maintaining family survival. However, these gender divisions were often flexible, with children learning whatever skills were most needed for their particular family circumstances. The absence of formal schools meant that peasant children received their education through apprenticeship, observation, and participation in daily activities. This experiential learning was often more comprehensive than formal education might have provided, as children gained practical skills directly applicable to their future survival. Needs. They learned to read weather patterns by observing adult behavior, understood agricultural timing through participation in planting and harvesting, and absorbed social skills through constant interaction with community members. Storytelling played a crucial role in peasant child education, serving as entertainment during long winter evenings, while also transmitting essential cultural knowledge. Folk tales and legends often contain practical information about surviving dangerous situations, recognizing trustworthy versus dangerous individuals, and understanding the natural world. These stories also provided moral education that helped children understand community values and behavioral expectations. Play activities among peasant children were rarely purely recreational, but instead served important educational functions that prepared them for adult responsibilities. Games involving the care of dolls taught nurturing skills essential for future parenting, while competitive activities developed the physical strength and coordination necessary for agricultural work. Even apparently frivolous play often involved mimicking adult activities in ways that provided genuine skill development. The religious education of peasant children was typically informal but comprehensive, involving regular participation in church services, seasonal celebrations, and daily prayers that reinforced spiritual beliefs while also strengthening community bonds. Children learned religious stories and practices that provided comfort during times of crisis, while also giving them access to the church-based social networks that could provide assistance and opportunity throughout their lives. Apprenticeship. Arrangements represented formal transitions from childhood dependency to adult responsibility, typically beginning between ages 12 and 14 when children were placed with masters, who would teach them specialized skills while providing food, shelter, and sometimes eventual employment opportunities. These arrangements required careful negotiation between families, as the choice of apprenticeship could determine a child's entire future career and social status. The health challenges facing peasant children required community-wide vigilance and sophisticated understanding of childhood diseases and developmental needs. Communities develop collective knowledge about recognizing and treating common childhood ailments, while also understanding that some children would inevitably be lost to diseases, accidents, or malnutrition that couldn't be prevented with. Available resources. Child labor was an economic necessity rather than exploitation, as peasant families needed every available contribution to ensure collective survival. However, communities also understood the importance of protecting children from responsibilities beyond their physical and emotional capabilities. The balance between useful contribution and protection from harm required constant adjustment based on individual children's development and family circumstances. Marriage preparation began early and involved not only practical skills development, but also the cultivation of social relationships that could lead to advantageous unions. Children learned to navigate complex kinship networks, understand property and inheritance systems, and develop the interpersonal skills necessary for successful partnerships. Parents began considering potential matches while children were still young, as marriage alliances could significantly affect entire family survival prospects. Orphan children faced particular challenges in medieval peasant communities, but they also benefited from informal adoption and support systems that ensured few children would be completely abandoned. Extended family members, godparents, and community members often assumed responsibility for orphan children, though these arrangements might involve obligations and dependencies that would last throughout the child's life. The transition to adulthood was gradual rather than marked by specific ceremonies, as young people progressively assumed greater responsibilities and independence, while remaining integrated into family and community survival systems. Marriage, establishment of independent households, and inheritance of property represented formal recognition of adult status, but the timing of these transitions depended on individual circumstances and community needs rather than predetermined. Age requirements, discipline, and behavioral correction were typically handled through community involvement rather than purely parental authority, as children's behavior affected not only their own families, but entire communities. Peer pressure, public shaming, and collective intervention were used to correct problematic behavior, while positive examples and community recognition reinforced desired conduct. The preservation of childhood, despite harsh survival conditions, reflected peasant communities' understanding that children represented their future and deserved protection and nurturing even when resources were scarce. Communities made significant sacrifices to ensure that children received adequate nutrition, education, and care, recognizing that investments in the next generation were essential for long-term survival. Literary and numerical skills, while not universally available, were sometimes taught to peasant children who showed particular aptitude or whose families had specific needs for these abilities. Some children learned basic reading skills through religious instruction, while others gained numerical literacy through involvement in trade or household management activities that required calculation and record-keeping. The development of individual identity within peasant children had to balance personal aspirations with community obligations and survival necessities. While children were encouraged to develop their unique talents and interests, they also learned that individual success was meaningful only within the context of family and community welfare, creating complex negotiations between personal desires and collective responsibilities. Asterisk. The liturgical calendar that governed medieval religious life was perfectly synchronized with agricultural necessities, creating systems that reflected seasonal cycles and farming needs while providing divine sanction for community cooperation. Advent, the period of preparation before Christmas, coincided with the natural rhythm of winter rest and community meal sharing, reinforcing social bonds that would be essential for coordinating spring planting and other collective activities. Palm Sunday and Holy Week provided opportunities for communities to renew their spiritual commitments, while also making practical preparations for the intensive agricultural work that lay ahead. The blessing of palm branches during religious ceremonies connected religious observance with agricultural fertility, while Holy Week services brought communities together for final planning before the busy spring season truly arrived. Easter. Celebrations marked not only Christ's resurrection, but also the renewal of agricultural life after winter's dormancy. The timing of Easter, based on the moon cycles, required communities to maintain sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles that also influenced agricultural calendar decisions. These feast days frequently required religious preparation, while also synchronizing spiritual renewal and community survival. The Spring Saints. Days that followed Easter were carefully aligned with specific agricultural activities, providing both protection and community cooperation for critical harvest preparations. St. George's Day on April 23rd marked the traditional beginning of growing season in many regions, while various local saints provided divine intervention for protection of newborn livestock. These festivals often combined religious devotion with practical knowledge, sharing as communities coordinated their planting schedules and agricultural activities. Rogation Days, the 3 days before Ascension Thursday, involved religious processions around parish boundaries that served multiple practical functions. These ceremonies not only reinforced community territorial claims, inspected boundary markers and agricultural conditions, and provided opportunities for neighbors to discuss planting schedules and coordinate agricultural activities. The blessing of fields and crops during these ceremonies combined practical agricultural support with divine intervention. Pentecost celebrations on the 50th day after Easter marked another critical agricultural period when spring crops were becoming established and communities could begin to assess their prospects for the harvest. The community activities during this religious period aided practical need for cooperation and mutual support during the critical growing season when collective effort could determine survival prospects. Summer. Saint days were often connected with specific crafts, agricultural activities, or protective functions that reflected community survival needs. St. John the Baptist's feast on June 24th, near the summer solstice, was celebrated with bonfires that provided both spiritual purification and practical benefits like insect control and community gathering opportunities. St. Peter and St. Paul's feast on June 29th marked the end of early harvest in many regions, while various local agricultural saints provided protection for specific crops or activities. The Assumption of Mary on August 15th typically coincided with early harvest activities in many regions, offering divine blessing for the critical work of gathering crops that could determine communal survival through the coming winter. The feast provided both spiritual meaning and practical knowledge of medicinal plants and food preservation techniques that were essential for community health and survival. Harvest festivals, often centered around local saints' days in late summer and early autumn, combined Thanksgiving for divine providence with practical matters of community food security for the coming year. These celebrations provided essential opportunities for communities to assess their resources, plan for winter survival, and strengthen social bonds that enhanced collective resilience, while also strengthening reciprocal obligations essential for collective endurance. All Saints' Day on November 1st and All Souls' Day on November 2nd marked the transition from harvest celebrations to winter preparations, while also providing spiritual connection with deceased community members who remain part of the social network that enabled survival. The emphasis on remembering the dead reinforced cultural continuity and traditional knowledge, while also strengthening family and community bonds, essential for collective endurance. The Feast of St. Martin on November 11th traditionally marked the end of the agricultural year and the beginning of winter preparation. This celebration involved the blessing of new wine and livestock that couldn't be maintained through winter, combining practical necessity with religious observance. Communities used the reflective nature of this season to pass down traditional knowledge and reinforce community solidarity. Advent and winter solstice marked the yearly cycle, but also winter's endurance was informed by the experiences and lessons of the previous 12 months. Communities used the reflective nature of this season to pass down traditional knowledge and reinforce community solidarity, planning strategies for the coming year, and strengthen communal foundations that enabled their continued existence at a challenging world. Local patron saints provided ongoing protection and identity for isolated communities, with feast days that created unique community identities while also providing spiritual resources for addressing particular environmental and economic challenges. The integration of pre-Christian traditions with Catholic observances created rich festivals that combined both natural harmony with Christian meaning, accumulating over centuries. Many day celebrations mixed acknowledgement of agricultural cycles with Christian teachings about natural cycles, while also providing community cohesion and spiritual meaning within an officially Christian framework. Religious art, music, and drama associated with these festivals served educational as well as entertainment functions, preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge essential for community survival. Mystery plays, religious songs, and visual art connected abstract spiritual concepts with practical agricultural activities and seasonal awareness that would prove essential for survival. The rhythm of medieval peasant life pulsed to the beat of sacred time, where the agricultural calendar merged seamlessly with religious observances to create a comprehensive framework for community survival, spiritual meaning, and social cohesion. The church year provided not merely spiritual guidance, but practical organization for economic activities, social relationships, and collective responses to the challenges that define peasant existence. Understanding this integration of sacred and secular reveals how medieval communities used religious traditions as sophisticated survival strategies that address both spiritual and material needs. The liturgical calendar that governed medieval religious life was perfectly synchronized with agricultural necessities, creating a system where spiritual observances reinforced practical survival activities while providing divine sanction for community cooperation. Advent, the period of preparation before Christmas, coincided with the completion of harvest activities and the beginning of winter survival preparations. The fasting and spiritual reflection required during this season paralleled the practical need to conserve food stores and prepare for the lean months ahead. Christmas celebrations far from being purely spiritual observances, served crucial social and economic functions that strengthened community bonds essential for survival. The exchange of gifts, while modest in peasant communities, created networks of reciprocal obligation that could be activated during times of crisis. Communal feasts brought families together to share resources and reinforce kinship ties, while also providing opportunities to negotiate marriages, apprenticeships, and other arrangements crucial for community continuity. The Epiphany season, culminating in Candlemas on February 2nd, marked the point when daylight hours began noticeably lengthening, providing psychological encouragement during the darkest period of the year. The blessing of candles during Candlemas had practical as well as spiritual significance, as these blessed lights were believed to provide protection against storms, disease, and other dangers that threatened winter survival. The holiday also marked the traditional end of Christmas, celebrations and the beginning of preparation for spring agricultural activities. Lent, the 40-day period of fasting and penance before Easter, was perfectly timed to coincide with the period when winter food stores were typically at their lowest levels. The religious requirement for reduced consumption matched the practical necessity of stretching limited supplies until spring crops could supplement community nutrition. The emphasis on prayer, charity, and community service during Lent reinforced social bonds that would be essential for coordinating spring planting and other collective activities. Palm Sunday and Holy Week provided opportunities for communities to renew their spiritual commitments while also making practical preparations for the intensive agricultural work that lay ahead. The blessing of palm branches and other vegetation connected religious observance with agricultural fertility, while Holy Week services brought communities together for final planning before the busy spring season began in earnest. Easter celebrations marked not only Christ's resurrection, but also the renewal of agricultural life after winter's dormancy. The timing of Easter, based on lunar calculations that varied from year to year, required communities to maintain sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles that also influenced agricultural planning. Easter foods, eggs, dairy products, and fresh vegetables represented the return of abundant nutrition after winter's limitations, while also symbolizing spiritual renewal and community survival. The spring saints' days that followed Easter were carefully aligned with specific agricultural activities, providing divine protection and community coordination for critical survival tasks. St. George's Day on April 23rd marked the traditional beginning of the growing season in many regions, while various local saints were invoked for protection of crops, livestock, and agricultural workers. These observances combined religious devotion with practical knowledge, sharing as communities coordinated their planting schedules and agricultural strategies. Rogation Days, the 3 days before Ascension Thursday, involved religious processions around parish boundaries that served multiple practical purposes beyond their spiritual significance. These processions reinforced community territorial claims, inspected boundary markers and agricultural conditions, and provided opportunities for resolving disputes and coordinating collective activities. The blessing of fields and crops during these ceremonies combined religious faith with practical agricultural support. Pentecost, celebrating the descent of the Holy Spirit, 50 days after Easter, typically coincided with the period when spring crops were becoming established and communities could begin to assess their prospects for the coming harvest. The emphasis on spiritual gifts and community unity reflected the practical need for cooperation and mutual support during the critical growing season when collective effort could determine survival prospects. Summer Saints' days were often connected with specific crafts, agricultural activities, or protective functions that reflected community survival needs. St. John the Baptist's feast on June 24th, near the summer solstice, was celebrated with bonfires that provided both spiritual significance and practical benefits, like insect control and community gathering opportunities. St. Peter and St. Paul's feast on June 29th often marked the beginning of haymaking season, while various local saints provided protection for specific crops or activities. The Assumption of Mary on August 15th typically coincided with early harvest activities in many regions, providing divine blessing for the crucial work of gathering crops that would sustain communities through the coming year. The blessing of herbs and flowers during this feast connected religious observance with practical knowledge of medicinal plants and food preservation techniques that were essential for community health and survival. Harvest festivals, often centered around local saints' days in late summer and early autumn, combined thanksgiving for divine providence with practical assessment of community food security for the coming year. These celebrations provided opportunities to share harvest bounty while also beginning the complex process of allocating resources and planning for winter survival. The communal nature of these festivals reinforced social bonds while also enabling collective decision-making about resource management. All Saints' Day on November 1st and All Souls' Day on November 2nd marked the transition from harvest celebration to winter preparation, while also providing spiritual connection with deceased community members whose wisdom and example continued to guide survival strategies. The emphasis on remembering the dead reinforced cultural continuity and traditional knowledge, while also strengthening family and community identities essential for collective resilience. The Feast of St. Martin on November 11th traditionally marked the end of the agricultural year and the beginning of winter survival mode. This celebration often involved the slaughter and preservation of livestock that couldn't be maintained through winter, combining practical necessity with religious observance. The sharing of meat during these festivals provided protein for winter survival while also reinforcing community solidarity. Advent's return completed the yearly cycle, but each year's observance was informed by the experiences and lessons of the previous 12 months. Communities used the reflective nature of this season to assess their survival strategies, plan improvements for the coming year, and strengthen the spiritual and social foundations that enabled their continued existence. In a challenging world, local patron saints provided ongoing protection and identity for individual communities, with feast days that reflected specific regional challenges and survival needs. Coastal communities might honor saints associated with maritime safety, while agricultural regions celebrated saints who protected crops and livestock. These local observances created unique community identities while also providing spiritual resources for addressing particular environmental and economic challenges. The integration of pre-Christian traditions with Catholic observances created rich festivals that combined official religious doctrine with folk wisdom accumulated over centuries of survival experience. May Day celebrations, harvest home festivals, and various seasonal observances preserved ancient knowledge about natural cycles while also providing community cohesion and spiritual meaning within an officially Christian framework. Religious. Art, music, and drama associated with these festivals served educational as well as entertainment functions, preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge essential for community survival. Mystery plays, religious songs, and visual art connected. Abstract spiritual concepts with practical. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe during the mid-14th century represented the ultimate test of medieval peasant survival strategies, creating demographic catastrophe that fundamentally transformed rural society while simultaneously demonstrating the resilience and adaptability that had enabled peasant communities to endure previous crises. The pandemic that swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351 killed an estimated one-third to one-half of the population, creating social disruption so profound that it marked the effective end of traditional feudal arrangements and the beginning of fundamental changes in peasant life. The initial impact of plague created immediate survival challenges that tested every aspect of peasant community resilience. Traditional support networks collapsed as entire families and sometimes entire villages succumbed to disease, leaving survivors without the familiar social structures that had previously provided security during times of crisis. The breakdown of normal agricultural cycles as peasants fled their villages or died during critical planting and harvest seasons created food shortages that compounded the direct mortality from disease. However, the demographic collapse also created unprecedented opportunities for surviving peasants to improve their material circumstances and social status. The dramatic reduction in population meant that available land far exceeded the number of workers needed to cultivate it, fundamentally altering the balance of power between lords and peasants that had defined medieval rural society. Peasants, who had previously struggled to survive on marginal holdings, suddenly found themselves able to acquire better lands or negotiate more favorable terms with landlords desperate to maintain agricultural production. The shortage of agricultural workers created a labor market that favored peasants for the first time in medieval history. Lords who had previously been able to command peasant labor through feudal obligations now found themselves competing for workers by offering higher wages, better working conditions, and greater personal freedom. This transformation challenged the fundamental assumptions of feudal society and created new possibilities for peasant prosperity and independence. Surviving peasant communities demonstrated remarkable adaptability in reorganizing their social structures to accommodate the massive population losses. Extended family networks became more important as nuclear families were decimated, while communities developed new forms of mutual aid and cooperation to replace traditional support systems. The mixing of populations as people fled affected areas and settled in new locations created opportunities for social mobility, previously unknown in medieval society. The psychological impact of experiencing such massive mortality created lasting changes in peasant attitudes and behavior. The realization that traditional authorities, both secular and religious, had been powerless to prevent or adequately respond to the crisis undermined established social hierarchies and created new assertiveness among surviving peasants. This psychological transformation would prove as important as economic changes in reshaping rural society. Women's roles underwent significant transformation as the demographic collapse created new opportunities and necessities, with traditional Male authority structures disrupted by massive mortality. Women often assumed responsibilities and gained independence that would have been impossible before the plague. This included not only managing households and agricultural activities, but also participating in economic activities and social negotiations, previously reserved for men. The economic disruption caused by population collapse forced innovations in agricultural techniques and land management that would have lasting consequences for rural development. With fewer workers available, surviving peasants adopted more intensive cultivation methods, invested in labor-saving technologies, and developed more efficient organizational systems. These changes often increased productivity per worker, even as total agricultural output declined. Religious and cultural responses to the plague crisis revealed both the breakdown of traditional institutional authority and the emergence of new forms of spiritual and community organization. Popular religious movements that emphasize personal spirituality and direct relationship with the divine gained strength as established church authority proved inadequate to address the crisis. These movements often supported peasant assertions of independence and social equality. The legal and administrative changes necessitated by massive mortality created opportunities for peasants to escape traditional feudal obligations and establish new relationships with authority. As legal records were lost, traditional obligations became difficult to enforce, while the practical need to repopulate vacant lands led authorities to offer more favorable terms to potential settlers. These changes created legal precedents that would permanently alter peasant status. Migration patterns changed dramatically as surviving peasants abandoned marginal lands and concentrated in more productive areas. This internal migration created new communities with different social dynamics, while allowing peasants to escape traditional local hierarchies. The freedom of movement that became necessary for survival also became a tool for social advancement and personal liberation. The intergenerational transmission of survival knowledge became more critical as traditional learning systems were disrupted by massive mortality. Surviving elders carried crucial knowledge about agricultural techniques, weather patterns, and survival strategies that needed to be preserved and transmitted to younger generations despite the breakdown of normal family and community structures. Market relationships and monetary exchange became more important as traditional fuel exchanges broke down and peasants gained greater control over their agricultural surplus. This commercialization of rural economy provided new opportunities for peasant accumulation of wealth while also creating new vulnerabilities to market fluctuations and economic instability. The emergence of peasant uprisings and social movements in the decades following the Black Death demonstrated both the new confidence of peasant communities and their continued vulnerability to elite resistance. While movements like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 were ultimately suppressed, they indicated the fundamental transformation of peasant consciousness and the permanent alteration of social relationships. The survival strategies developed by medieval peasants over centuries of facing existential challenges created a foundation of human resilience that extends far beyond the medieval period, establishing principles of community cooperation, resource management, and adaptive innovation that continue to inform approaches to crisis management and sustainable development in the modern world. The sophistication of peasant survival systems challenges common assumptions about medieval backwardness while demonstrating the remarkable human capacity for creative adaptation under extreme constraints. The agricultural innovations, pioneered by medieval peasants, laid the groundwork for food security systems that enabled Europe's population growth and economic development in subsequent centuries. The three-field system, crop rotation techniques, and integrated animal husbandry developed through peasant experimentation created sustainable agricultural systems that supported increasing population density while maintaining soil fertility. These achievements represent some of humanity's most important contributions to agricultural science and environmental management. Community organization structures developed by peasant villages provided models for cooperative governance and mutual aid that influenced the development of democratic institutions and social welfare systems. The principles of collective decision-making, shared resource management, and community responsibility for individual welfare that emerged from peasant survival necessities contributed to broader concepts of social solidarity and political participation that became fundamental to later democratic movements. The economic innovations created by peasant communities, including local markets, craft specialization, and resource-sharing networks, established foundations for commercial development, while demonstrating sustainable approaches to economic organization that balanced individual initiative with community welfare. These systems provided alternatives to purely extractive economic relationships and created models for economic development that prioritized long-term community stability over short-term accumulation. Women's contributions to medieval peasant survival, while often under-recognized in historical accounts, established precedents for gender equality and female leadership that will become important in later social movements. The practical necessities of peasant life that required women's full participation in economic, social, and decision-making activities created experiences of gender partnership that challenged patriarchal assumptions and provided models for more equitable social organization. The integration of spiritual and practical approaches to community survival developed by peasant communities created holistic understanding of human welfare that recognized connections between individual health, community solidarity, and environmental stewardship. This integrated approach offered alternatives to purely materialistic or purely spiritual approaches to human development, while demonstrating the importance of meaning and purpose in sustaining human communities through difficult periods. Knowledge preservation and transmission systems developed by peasant communities established methods for maintaining cultural continuity and practical expertise across generations despite limited literacy and formal educational institutions. These oral traditions, community practices, and experiential learning systems created robust foundations for cultural survival that proved more durable than many formal institutional arrangements. Environmental management techniques developed through peasant agricultural and resource management practices established early models for sustainable development that balanced human needs with ecological preservation. The long-term perspective required for peasant survival created conservation practices and resource management strategies that maintained environmental health while supporting human communities over centuries. Medical and healthcare innovations emerging from peasant communities contributed to the development of public health approaches and preventive medicine that recognize connections between individual health, community welfare, and environmental conditions. The community-based healthcare systems developed by peasants provided models for healthcare delivery that emphasize prevention, community support, and integration of physical and mental health care, the conflict resolution and dispute management. Systems developed by peasant communities provided alternatives to violence and coercion while maintaining community cohesion despite limited formal legal authority. These systems created precedents for community-based justice and restorative approaches to social problems that influenced later developments in law and social organization. Educational approaches that emerged from peasant survival needs, including practical skill development, environmental observation, and community knowledge sharing, establish models for experiential education and community-based learning that recognize diverse forms of intelligence and knowledge. These approaches provided alternatives to purely academic education while demonstrating the importance of practical skills and community knowledge for human development. The adaptability and innovation demonstrated by peasant communities in responding to changing conditions and external challenges created cultural attitudes toward change and problem solving that emphasize creative adaptation rather than rigid adherence to tradition. This cultural flexibility proved essential for survival during periods of social transformation while providing models for healthy approaches to social change. Resistance strategies developed by peasant communities provided examples of effective responses to oppression and exploitation that influenced later social movements and democratic developments. The combination of community solidarity, strategic thinking, and moral authority that characterized peasant resistance created precedents for nonviolent resistance and social reform movements. The psychological resilience developed by peasant communities through centuries of facing existential challenges created understanding of mental health and community support that recognized the importance of social connections, meaningful work, and cultural continuity for human psychological welfare. These insights contributed to modern understanding of mental health while demonstrating the importance of community-based approaches to psychological resilience. The legacy of medieval peasant survival extends into contemporary challenges including climate change, economic inequality, social disruption, and political instability. The principles of community cooperation, sustainable resource management, adaptive innovation, and collective resilience developed through peasant survival experiences provide guidance for addressing modern crises while demonstrating the continued relevance of community-based approaches to human welfare. Understanding the sophistication and effectiveness of medieval peasant survival strategies challenges contemporary assumptions about progress and development while providing alternative models for human organization that prioritize sustainability, community welfare, and long-term survival over short-term accumulation and individual competition. These historical experiences demonstrate human capacity for creating resilient communities even under extreme constraints, while providing inspiration for addressing contemporary challenges. The story of medieval peasant survival ultimately represents one of humanity's great achievements in collective resilience, demonstrating that ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges can create sophisticated systems of cooperation, innovation, and mutual support that enable not merely survival, but the foundation for human flourishing. Their legacy continues to inform contemporary efforts to create more resilient, equitable, and sustainable human communities. The survival of medieval peasants through plague, famine, and feudal oppression represents one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of human resilience and adaptive capacity. Their sophisticated strategies of community cooperation, sustainable agriculture, conflict resolution, and cultural preservation created foundations for human development that continue to influence contemporary approaches to crisis management and social organization. This complete journey through medieval peasant survival reveals not primitive backwardness, but sophisticated understanding of human welfare, environmental management, and community organization that enabled ordinary people to create extraordinary resilience under extreme constraints. Their story provides both historical insight and contemporary inspiration for building more resilient, equitable, and sustainable human communities.